A seasoned police officer stops to check on a shivering, abandoned little girl at a bus stop late at night. To comfort her, he hands her his wallet. But when she opens it, a tiny, creased photo falls onto her lap. Ryan's breath catches. It's her. The same baby photo he's carried for years. The child he and his late fiancée were supposed to adopt. The girl looks up at him, eyes brimming with tears, and whispers, "Dada." His world shatters. How did she end up here? What happened to the family meant to protect her? And now that she's back in his arms, can he fight to keep her forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The streetlights cast long shadows across Ryan Mitchell's police cruiser as he drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Grove. At this hour, most windows were dark, and the only sound was the soft purr of his engine and the occasional crackle of his radio. He'd driven these same streets hundreds of times during his night shifts, but tonight felt heavier than usual. The autumn air pressed against his windows, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. His hand drifted to his wallet, fingers brushing against the worn edge of a photograph he knew by heart. He pulled it out, letting the dim dashboard lights illuminate the image for just a moment. A baby girl with bright eyes and a toothless smile, her tiny hands reaching toward the camera. That was 3 years ago, before the accident, before Claire. Ryan shoved the photo back into his wallet, his jaw tight. Some nights, the memories felt like a physical weight on his chest, pressing down until it was hard to breathe. He and Claire had been so close to adopting that little girl. They'd already picked out her room colors, bought a tiny dresser, chosen her name. Every detail had been planned with such hope and joy. Then came the rainy night, the slick roads, the phone call that changed everything. The radio's static cut through his thoughts. "Unit 12, come in." "Unit 12, Ryan responded automatically, grateful for the distraction from his memories. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Emily Carter's familiar voice came through clearly. He'd known the dispatcher for years. She'd been there that night 3 years ago, too. Her voice had guided him through the worst moment of his life. "We have a possible abandoned child at the corner of Franklin and Main. Young female, approximately 3 years old." There was a pause, and when Emily continued, her voice was softer, more hesitant. "No guardian in sight. Witness reports seeing her alone for over an hour." Ryan's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, the leather creaking under his grip. "Copy that. Unit 12 responding." He flipped on his emergency lights, the blue and red cutting through the darkness as he made a sharp turn toward Franklin Street, tires squealing slightly on the damp pavement. 3 years old. The same age as... He pushed the thought away, focusing on the road ahead. The streets were empty at this hour, allowing him to move quickly through the sleeping town. His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding, maybe the parent was nearby, maybe... The dashboard clock blinked mockingly. 11:27 p.m. But 11:30 at night was no time for a toddler to be alone. Ryan knew the statistics, knew what happened to abandoned children in the system. He'd seen it too many times in his 15 years on the force, watched too many young lives get swallowed up by bureaucracy and indifference. The intersection of Franklin and Main came into view. A single streetlight flickered erratically, casting unstable shadows across the empty bus stop. Ryan pulled up slowly, not wanting to frighten whoever might be there. Through his windshield, he could make out a small shape huddled against the bus stop's metal bench, barely visible in the unreliable light. His throat tightened. The figure was tiny, too tiny to be out here alone in the cold night air. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cruiser, the cool fall air immediately seeping through his uniform like icy fingers. The door's closing sound seemed too loud in the quiet night, echoing off the empty storefronts. "This is Officer Mitchell," he called out softly, approaching with measured steps. His boots scraped against the sidewalk, each sound seeming to hang in the still air. "I'm here to help." As he drew closer, the flickering streetlight revealed more details. A small form curled up on the cold pavement, shivering in what looked like thin pajamas. His heart hammered in his chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. The world seemed to narrow down to just this moment, just this child, just this night. Ryan's boots crunched on the loose gravel as he approached the bus stop. His heart hammered in his chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. The flickering streetlight cast shifting shadows across the small figure huddled against the metal bench. She was so tiny, wrapped in an oversized sweater that seemed to swallow her whole, her small frame almost lost in the fabric's folds. "Hey there," he called softly, keeping his voice gentle, the way he'd been trained to speak to frightened children. The girl didn't move, didn't even look up. She just clutched her worn, stuffed rabbit tighter, pressing it against her chest like a shield. The toy had clearly seen better days. One ear was hanging by threads, and its fur was matted and gray, darkened by years of loving wear. A man in his 50s stood nearby, wringing his hands nervously. His diner uniform, complete with a grease-stained apron, marked him as someone who worked the late shift. "Officer," he said, stepping forward, his shoes scuffing against the sidewalk. "I'm George Lawson, I called it in." Ryan nodded, acknowledging him while keeping his eyes on the child. "How long has she been here?" "Over an hour now. I spotted her when I got off my shift at the diner." Mr. Lawson gestured toward the small restaurant down the block, its neon sign casting a soft red glow in the darkness. "I thought maybe her folks were inside, but nobody ever came out. Couldn't just leave her here, you know? Not with the temperature dropping like this." The cool breeze rustled through the fallen leaves, sending them skittering across the sidewalk, and Ryan noticed the girl shiver. Her shoes didn't match. One was a pink sneaker with a broken lace, the other a dirty white sandal with a missing strap. The sweater she wore had holes at the sleeves, threads hanging loose, and her hair looked like it hadn't been brushed in days, tangled and falling in her face. Ryan crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening, the way he always did with scared kids. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice barely disturbing the quiet night air. "Where's your mommy?" The child flinched at his voice, her small fingers digging deeper into the rabbit's worn fabric. She curled further into herself, making her already tiny frame seem even smaller, like she was trying to disappear completely. Mr. Lawson shifted uncomfortably behind them, his keys jingling in his pocket. "She hasn't said a word the whole time, just sits there holding that rabbit. Poor little thing's trembling like a leaf." Ryan's stomach clenched, a familiar ache settling in his chest. In his 15 years on the force, he'd seen too many cases like this. Children left behind, abandoned by those who should have protected them. Each one left a mark on his soul. He shrugged off his jacket, the fabric rustling in the night air, holding it out to her. "Are you cold?" he asked gently. "You can use this if you want. It's nice and warm." The jacket remained untaken, hanging in the space between them like an unspoken question. The girl's oversized sweater slipped off one shoulder, revealing skin that was too pale, too thin, marked with goosebumps from the cold. Everything about her screamed neglect, from her unkempt appearance to her defensive posture. "It's okay, sweetheart," Ryan tried again, his voice barely above a whisper, soft as falling snow. "I'm here to help. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you." For just a moment, so brief he almost missed it, the girl's eyes flicked up to meet his. Big brown eyes, filled with a fear no child should know, peered out from behind stringy bangs, dark and haunting in the dim light. Wanting to ease her fear, to show her something friendly and normal, Ryan reached for his wallet, the leather smooth against his fingers. "Look," he said, starting to flip through the photos inside, hoping to find something that might make her feel more at ease. "Would you like to see some pictures?" The leather wallet was worn soft from years of use, its edges rounded and familiar in his hands, and as he opened it, a small, creased photograph slipped free. It fluttered down like an autumn leaf, landing gently in the girl's lap, face up in the pool of streetlight. Ryan's hand trembled as he stared at the photograph in the little girl's grip. The streetlight cast just enough glow to illuminate the familiar creases in that worn picture, the same ones he'd traced countless times over the past 3 years, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, like someone was squeezing it with invisible hands. The photo showed a tiny baby with bright eyes and dark curls, her toothless smile beaming up from the glossy paper. He and Claire had received it from the adoption agency right before everything fell apart. They'd been so close to becoming parents, so close to giving this little girl a home. He remembered how Claire had immediately started buying tiny dresses and planning the nursery colors. This can't be," Ryan whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Mr. Lawson had already left, his footsteps fading into the night, leaving them alone at the quiet bus stop. Fallen leaves skittered across the sidewalk in the chilly breeze, dancing past their feet like tiny ghosts. The little girl's fingers clutched the photo tighter, pressing it against her worn stuffed rabbit, its fur matted and gray, one ear hanging by threads. Her other hand reached out, tentatively touching the badge on Ryan's uniform, as if making sure he was real. The metal gleamed under the streetlight as her small fingers traced its outline, leaving smudges that caught the light. Ryan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His police training had prepared him for countless scenarios, shootouts, hostage situations, high-speed chases, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment. He studied her face, really looked at it for the first time. Those same dark curls from the baby photo, now longer and tangled, framing her small face. Those same bright eyes, now filled with tears and something else. Recognition? Hope? Dada? That single word, barely a whisper, hit Ryan like a physical blow. He jerked backward, nearly losing his balance despite being on one knee, his boots scraping against the rough concrete. His mind raced with questions, each one more urgent than the last. How was she here? What had happened? She was supposed to be with a family. Safe, loved, protected. Not alone at a bus stop in the middle of the night with nothing but a stuffed rabbit and a creased photograph. The little girl, Ella, his mind supplied her name with crystal clarity, the same way he remembered Claire's laugh, flinched at his sudden movement. She curled further into herself, making herself smaller, but her eyes never left his face. Those eyes held too much pain for someone so young, too much understanding of how cruel the world could be. Ryan's hands shook as he tried to steady himself against the metal bench. The world seemed to spin around him, everything he thought he knew shifting and realigning like pieces of a broken kaleidoscope. 3 years of grief, of wondering what could have been, crashed into this single moment under a flickering streetlight. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing the words past the lump in his throat. I'm here. I'm right here. Ella's bottom lip trembled. A tear rolled down her cheek, catching the dim light like a diamond before disappearing into the collar of her too big sweater. She still held the photo like it was precious treasure, but her other hand reached out again, not toward his badge this time, but toward him, her tiny fingers stretching across the space between them. Ryan felt his heart slam against his ribs so hard it hurt. This little girl, this child he and Claire had dreamed of holding, had prepared a nursery for, had loved before they even met her, was sitting here on the cold pavement, alone, abandoned. The yellow stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest was the only sign that anyone had ever cared for her at all. The reality of it hit him in waves, each one stronger than the last. Each realization brought fresh pain, like salt in an old wound. She wasn't just any abandoned child. She was their child. The one they'd chosen. The one they'd lost when everything. His vision blurred with tears as he looked at her mismatched shoes, her oversized sweater with its frayed cuffs, the way her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. What had happened to her? How had she ended up here of all places on his patrol route? What twist of fate or divine intervention had brought them together on this cold autumn night? The questions swirled in his mind like autumn leaves in a storm, but they didn't matter. Not right now. What mattered was the little girl in front of him, shivering in the cold, looking at him with eyes that somehow knew him, that held on to hope despite everything she'd been through. The patrol car's heater hummed steadily as Ryan secured Ella in the passenger seat. His police jacket swallowed her tiny frame, making her look even smaller than she was. Her eyes, heavy with exhaustion, kept drifting down to the crumpled photograph in her hands, her small fingers tracing the worn edges with a gentleness that made his heart clench. Ryan's fingers shook as he reached for his radio. The familiar weight felt different tonight, heavier somehow, like it carried the weight of all his unanswered questions. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I need an immediate search on missing children reports. Female, approximately 3 years old, found at Franklin in Maine." Emily's voice crackled back, calm and clear through the static. "Copy that, Unit 12. Running the search now." The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity as Ryan watched Ella's drooping eyelids. No current matches in the system, Ryan. Nothing within a 100-mile radius. Ryan's stomach dropped, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He glanced at Ella, who was running her small finger along the edge of the photograph, lost in her own quiet world. "What about Child Protective Services? Any reports of a child matching her description?" "Negative," Emily replied after another moment, her voice tinged with concern. "No reports filed. Do you need me to contact the on-call social worker?" "Stand by on that." Ryan's mind raced, spinning through possibilities and scenarios. No missing reports, no CPS records. It was like this little girl had simply appeared out of thin air. But he knew better. He knew exactly where she came from, or at least where she was supposed to be. The thought made his chest tighten painfully. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling as he scrolled through his contacts. The number for Happy Heart's adoption agency was still there, saved from 3 years ago, untouched like so many other memories he couldn't bring himself to erase. He'd never had the heart to delete it, just like he couldn't delete Claire's number or the photos from their last vacation together. Ella's head bobbed slightly as she fought sleep, still clutching that precious photograph like a lifeline. The sight made Ryan's chest ache with a familiar pain. She looked so much like the baby in that picture, the same one he and Claire had received when they were matched for adoption. The same dark curls, the same deep brown eyes, even the same slight furrow in her brow when she concentrated. The phone felt heavy in his hand as he pressed dial, each movement deliberate and weighted with purpose. It was nearly midnight. No one would be there. But they had to have an emergency line, right? They had to have some record of what happened to her after Claire. After everything fell apart. "Please," he whispered, watching Ella's eyelids droop lower with each passing second. "Please pick up." The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring echoed in the quiet car, mixing with the soft sound of Ella's steady breathing and the gentle hum of the heater. She was finally giving in to exhaustion, her small body curling up under his jacket like a cat seeking warmth. Ryan's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as the phone continued to ring endlessly into the night. Someone had to know what happened. Someone had to explain how the little girl who was supposed to be his daughter ended up alone on a street corner, abandoned and forgotten. The questions burned in his throat like acid, demanding answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. The ringing continued, unanswered, as Ryan sat in his idling patrol car, torn between fury and heartbreak, watching over the sleeping child who had once been meant to be his. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast harsh shadows as Ryan carried Ella through the sliding doors. His police jacket engulfed her small frame, and she clung to both it and the baby photo with desperate determination. The night shift's quiet was broken only by the steady beeping of distant monitors and the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. The antiseptic smell that permeated every hospital hung heavy in the air, making the space feel even more clinical and stark. Nurse Jessica Harper looked up from her station, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. She hurried over, her auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun, concern etched on her face. Her navy scrubs rustled softly as she moved with practiced efficiency. "I need her checked immediately," Ryan said, his voice strained. "She was abandoned at a bus stop." His arms tightened protectively around Ella's tiny body. Jessica nodded, her movements efficient but gentle. "Follow me." She led them to a small exam room decorated with cheerful cartoon characters that seemed out of place against the sterile walls. A friendly giraffe smiled down from one wall, its painted eyes watching over the room's occupants. When Ryan tried to set Ella down on the exam table, she whimpered and gripped his hand tighter. His heart clenched. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm right here." The paper covering the exam table crinkled beneath her as she reluctantly settled. Jessica worked with practiced care, checking Ella's vital signs while speaking in soft, soothing tones. "Hi there, sweetie. I'm just going to look you over. Make sure you're okay." Ella remained silent, but allowed the examination, her small fingers never leaving Ryan's. Her eyes darted between Jessica and the door, as if mapping escape routes. "She's underweight," Jessica murmured, making notes on her chart, "and showing signs of mild dehydration." She gently examined Ella's arms and legs. "No recent injuries, but there are some old bruises." Her pen scratched against the paper as she documented each finding with meticulous care. Ryan's jaw tightened. The thought of anyone hurting this child made his blood boil, his free hand clenched into a fist at his side. "Who is she to you?" Jessica asked quietly, glancing between them. The question hung heavy in the air. Ryan swallowed hard. She was supposed to be my daughter." The words felt raw in his throat. The weight of lost years pressed down on his shoulders. The exam room door opened and Linda Dawson entered, her gray suit as crisp as her expression. She carried a tablet and wore the weary look of someone who'd seen too many similar cases. Her sensible shoes clicked against the floor as she approached. "Officer Mitchell," she said with a professional nod. "I'm Linda Dawson from Child Protective Services. What do we know about the child?" Her fingers hovered over her tablet, ready to document every detail. "She was found alone at the corner of Franklin and Main," Ryan reported. "No ID, no note, nothing except the clothes she's wearing and this stuffed rabbit." The worn toy sat beside Ella, its floppy ears bearing testament to years of love and worry. Linda's fingers moved across her tablet. "Has she spoken at all?" "Just one word," Ryan said, remembering Ella's whispered dada that had shaken his world. The memory of that soft voice made his chest tight. "Do you have any leads on her identity?" Linda pressed. Ryan's jaw worked. "I have a strong suspicion, but I need confirmation." His police instinct screamed that there was more to this story than abandoned children and missing papers. Linda frowned at her tablet, scrolling through the database. "There are no current reports of missing children matching her description in our system." She looked up, her expression troubled. "It's as if she doesn't exist." Ryan watched Ella curl up on the hospital bed, still clutching his hand. The baby photo lay on her lap, wrinkled but precious. Someone had taken this child, his child, and erased her from the system. Someone had stolen 3 years of her life and his. The thought settled like ice in his stomach as he squeezed Ella's hand gently, silently promising to uncover the truth. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room buzzed overhead as Ryan shifted in his uncomfortable plastic chair. His muscles ached from sitting for hours, but he didn't dare move too much. The clock on the wall seemed frozen at 3 a.m., making the night feel endless. Beside him, Ella was finally sleeping, wrapped in a hospital blanket, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Her worn stuffed rabbit remained clutched tightly in her arms, its floppy ears showing years of love and wear. The sound of clicking heels made Ryan look up. Linda Dawson approached with a manila folder, her face set in a serious expression that made his stomach clench. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she'd been working as long as he had. She stopped in front of them, adjusting her glasses with one hand while juggling her paperwork with the other. "Officer Mitchell, given the circumstances, we're placing her in emergency foster care." Ryan's body went rigid. "No." The word came out sharp and firm, echoing slightly in the empty waiting room. Linda sighed, clearly having expected this reaction. Her shoulders slumped slightly as she spoke. "You're not a registered guardian. She can't stay with you." Ryan stood abruptly, his police uniform wrinkled from the long night. The badge on his chest caught the fluorescent light as he moved. "No one even reported her missing," he said, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Ella. "If I leave her now, she'll get lost in the system. I can't let that happen." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. Linda's eyes softened slightly as she looked at the sleeping child. The little girl's face showed traces of dried tears, even in sleep. "You'd need a legal basis." "Then make me her temporary guardian," Ryan said without hesitation. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with determination. Linda studied him for a long moment, her expression conflicted. Her fingers drummed against the folder before she finally pulled some papers from inside. "This isn't standard procedure," she warned, but started filling out the forms anyway, her pen scratching against the paper in the quiet room. Ryan's shoulders relaxed slightly as he signed paper after paper. Each signature felt like a promise, a step toward keeping Ella safe. His hand trembled slightly with exhaustion, but his writing remained steady and determined. Linda explained the temporary custody arrangement, but Ryan barely heard her. All he could focus on was that Ella wouldn't be taken away. When the last form was signed, Linda handed him a copy, the paper still warm from the printer. "This is temporary," she reminded him, her tone gentler now. "We'll need to schedule follow-up visits." Ryan nodded, already turning to Ella. He gathered her gently in his arms, careful not to wake her. Her small body felt so fragile against his chest, warm and trusting even in sleep. As he carried her through the quiet hospital corridors, their footsteps echoing against the linoleum floors, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion and fear. "Where go?" she whispered sleepily, her tiny fingers clutching her rabbit tighter. "Home," Ryan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You're coming home." In the parking lot, the cold night air nipped at their faces as Ryan carefully settled her into the car seat the hospital had provided. The plastic still had price tags on it, evidence of its hasty purchase. As he reached across to buckle her in, Ella's small fingers gripped his shirt, refusing to let go. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, breaking his heart with two simple words. No go, Dada." Ryan felt his throat tighten, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. She thought he was going to abandon her too, just like everyone else had. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, the leather creaking under his grip. Never. He would never leave her alone again. The promise settled in his chest, as solid and permanent as his own heartbeat. The yellow glow of the porch light cast long shadows as Ryan carried Ella through his front door. The house was exactly as he'd left it 12 hours ago, neat, organized, and completely unprepared for a child. His footsteps echoed in the quiet living room, a space that had felt too big and too empty for 3 years. Now, with this tiny figure in his arms, the emptiness seemed less overwhelming, though the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. Ella's head rested against his shoulder, but her eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail. Her stuffed rabbit, worn and gray from years of love, remained clutched tightly in her small fist. Ryan noticed how she tensed slightly at unfamiliar shadows, her fingers digging deeper into the rabbit's matted fur whenever a car passed outside, its headlights dancing across the walls. "This is home," he said softly, his voice gentle in the darkness. "You're safe here." The words felt both right and terrifying, a promise he wasn't sure how to keep, but knew he had to make. The reality of the situation hit him as he stood in his living room. He had nothing, no bed, no clothes, no toys for a 3-year-old. The house that had once been prepared for her arrival now stood as a testament to what could have been. The empty corner where a dollhouse should have stood seemed to mock him. Ryan moved quickly, gathering what he could. He pulled soft blankets from the hall closet, their fresh laundry scent filling the air. Extra pillows came next, and he arranged them carefully on the couch, creating a cozy nest. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do for tonight. He added an extra throw pillow, remembering how Claire had always said children needed to feel surrounded by softness. "Here we go, sweetheart," he said, helping her settle into the makeshift bed. "Try to get some sleep." His hand lingered on the blanket, smoothing it unnecessarily. But sleep didn't come. Ella sat among the blankets, her big brown eyes fixed on Ryan. She looked so small, swimming in his old police academy t-shirt that he'd given her as makeshift pajamas. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the quiet ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Minutes passed. Ryan stayed beside her, watching as she fought against exhaustion. Her tiny hand reached out, fingers wrapping around his sleeve with surprising strength. The gesture made his heart ache. She was afraid he'd disappear just like everyone else had. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll be right here." He settled more comfortably on the floor beside the couch, ignoring the protest in his knees. She blinked slowly, still holding his sleeve. Ryan reached over and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, making sure she was warm enough. The stuffed rabbit found its place tucked securely under her chin. The night stretched on, and eventually Ella's grip on his sleeve loosened as she drifted off to sleep. Ryan stayed, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, afraid that if he moved, this would all turn out to be a dream. The streetlight outside cast a soft glow through the curtains, highlighting the dried tear tracks on her cheeks. But at 3:30 a.m., the dream became a nightmare. Ella's scream pierced the quiet house, sending Ryan's heart into his throat. He was at her side in an instant, finding her thrashing against the blankets, tears streaming down her face. The rabbit had fallen to the floor, forgotten in her terror. Hey, I'm here," he said, gathering her into his arms. Her small body trembled against his chest as he held her close, rocking gently back and forth. "You're safe, sweetheart. You're safe." He could feel her heart racing, a frightened bird beating against his chest. Ella's sobs gradually quieted to hiccups, but her fingers remained twisted in his shirt. Ryan continued rocking, humming softly, an old habit from his own childhood. The gentle motion seemed to help, and slowly, very slowly, her breathing steadied. Her tears soaked through his shirt, but he didn't mind. Looking down at her tear-stained face, Ryan felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. Someone had hurt this little girl. Someone had abandoned her, left her alone and scared. The thought made his jaw clench and his arms tighten instinctively around her small frame. But now, as she clung to him in the darkness, he made a silent promise. Whatever demons haunted her dreams, whatever fears lived in her heart, he would face them with her. He would help her heal. The path ahead would be difficult, but in that moment, holding this fragile, precious child, he knew with absolute certainty that they would walk it together. Ryan's kitchen was bathed in early morning sunlight, but he barely noticed its warmth. His third cup of coffee sat cooling on the counter as he watched Ella push scrambled eggs around her plate with a fork too big for her tiny hands. Dark circles lined his eyes from a night of broken sleep, interrupted by Ella's nightmares. The sound of her crying still echoed in his mind, along with the way she'd clung to him when he rushed to comfort her. He pulled out his phone, staring at the number he hadn't dialed in 3 years. His thumb hovered over Mark Reynolds' contact information. The name brought back memories of paperwork and promises, of Claire's excited smile as they prepared for an adoption that never happened. With a deep breath, he pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. "Hello? Mark? It's Ryan Mitchell." There was a pause on the other end. "Ryan, it's been a while. I need information about the adoption from 3 years ago, the one Claire and I were supposed to complete." Ryan's voice was tight, controlled, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The baby girl another family took instead. The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Mark sighed heavily, the sound crackling through the speaker. "I remember that case, but there's something you need to know." Ryan's pulse quickened. He glanced at Ella, who was now carefully stacking her eggs into a little mountain, her tongue poking out in concentration. "What?" "That adoption." Mark's voice grew heavy with regret. It was never finalized. The words hit Ryan like a physical blow. He gripped the kitchen counter to steady himself, feeling the cool granite beneath his trembling fingers. "What do you mean?" "The couple, they returned her to the system, but there was a clerical error. She was never reassigned." Mark's voice cracked slightly, shame seeping through his professional tone. She fell through the cracks. Ryan's knuckles turned white against the counter. You're telling me she was abandoned twice? Yes. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Fury rose in Ryan's chest, hot and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. Someone had thrown her away, twice, like she was nothing more than paperwork to be filed and forgotten. His gaze drifted to Ella, still focused on her breakfast creation, completely unaware of the conversation that was unraveling her past. A strand of her dark hair fell across her face, and she absently tucked it behind her ear. She didn't know. She had no idea she'd been discarded so carelessly, treated like an afterthought by people who should have protected her. The fork in her small hand scraped against the plate as she continued to play with her food, lost in her own quiet world. The morning light caught the silver utensil, making it flash like a beacon. Ryan's jaw clenched as he watched her. She deserved so much better than what life had given her so far. She deserved to be cherished, protected, loved, not abandoned and forgotten. The weight of her past settled on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. His voice was steel when he spoke again, leaving no room for argument. I'm going to need all the paperwork, Mark. Everything you have on her case. Of course, Mark replied quietly, clearly recognizing the determination in Ryan's tone. I'll send it right over. Ryan ended the call, his hand shaking slightly as he set the phone down on the counter with a soft click. He looked at Ella again, at her innocent face concentrated on her breakfast art, and his heart ached with a fierce protectiveness. She had no idea she was never wanted, but Ryan knew. And he swore, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He would never let her be discarded again. Not while he drew breath. The morning sunlight streamed through Ryan's kitchen windows, casting warm patches across the worn linoleum floor. The coffee maker gurgled its last few drops into the pot, filling the air with its rich aroma. A few birds chirped outside, welcoming the new day. Ryan leaned against the counter, watching Ella at the table. She looked so small in the adult-sized chair, her feet dangling well above the floor, her purple pajamas making her seem even tinier. Not hungry? Ryan asked softly, noticing how she gripped her spoon but hadn't touched the scrambled eggs he'd made. The toast was getting cold, and the orange juice remained untouched. He'd added a small pat of butter to the eggs, remembering how Claire used to say it made them taste better. Ella's eyes darted between Ryan and the plate. With careful, deliberate movements, she pushed half of her toast to the far edge of the plate. Her tiny fingers arranged it precisely, like she was following some internal rule only she understood. A small crumb fell to the table and she quickly picked it up, placing it back with the saved portion. Ryan's heart squeezed in his chest as understanding dawned. He'd seen this before in his years as an officer, children who'd learned to stretch their meals because they didn't know when they'd eat again. The thought of Ella going hungry made his throat tight. His hands clenched involuntarily at his sides. You don't have to save it, sweetheart, he said, keeping his voice gentle as he moved closer to the table. There's plenty more. He opened the bread bag, showing her the remaining slices. See? Lots of food here. We can even go to the store later and get your favorite kind. Ella's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the full bread bag. She glanced back at her plate, then up at Ryan, studying his face as if searching for any sign of deception. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. A car honked outside, making her jump slightly. Finally, she picked up a piece of toast with trembling fingers and took a tiny bite. Ryan released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She chewed slowly, deliberately, still watching him from beneath her lashes. A few golden crumbs stuck to her chin. That's it, he encouraged, sliding into the chair beside her. You can eat it all if you're hungry, and there's more eggs too if you want them. Throughout the day, Ryan made sure to show Ella the fully stocked refrigerator and pantry. He let her watch as he prepared lunch, explaining each step and letting her smell the ingredients. By dinner time, she was eating without saving portions of her food, though her movements were still cautious, like a baby bird learning to trust. That evening, Ryan sank into his couch, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. The TV hummed quietly in the background, more for comfortable noise than entertainment. A rerun of some old sitcom cast flickering blue light across the walls. He'd made the makeshift bed on the couch again, complete with fresh blankets and extra pillows, arranging them just the way she seemed to like. But instead of climbing into the temporary bed, Ella stood uncertainly nearby. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, shifting from foot to foot, its floppy ears swaying with her movement. Then, slowly, carefully, she approached Ryan. His breath caught as she climbed onto his lap, her small body curling against his chest like she belonged there. Ryan sat perfectly still, afraid to break this moment of trust. Ella's warmth seeped through his shirt, and her rabbit's worn ear tickled his chin. She smelled of the baby shampoo he'd bought in a rush trip to the store, and her breathing gradually steadied into a peaceful rhythm. Her small hand clutched a handful of his shirt, holding on as if to make sure he wouldn't disappear. In that quiet moment, Ryan felt his heart crack wide open with love and protection for this tiny, brave soul who was finally allowing herself to feel safe. He gently rested his chin on top of her head, listening to the soft sounds of her breathing mixing with the distant murmur of the TV, creating a lullaby of trust and new beginnings. Ryan's fingers tapped nervously against his coffee mug as he scrolled through the case files on his laptop, the morning sun filtering in through the kitchen windows and casting a warm glow across the wooden table. Ella sat cross-legged on the living room floor, carefully arranging her beloved stuffed rabbit next to some toy cars that Ryan had dug out of storage, a comforting ritual she had adopted. Every now and then, she would glance his way, as if making sure he was still there before returning to her meticulous arrangement. The sharp knock at the door made both Ryan and Ella jump, and he noticed how Ella's small shoulders tensed, her hands gripping her rabbit tighter in apprehension. Her bottom lip trembled slightly. "It's okay, sweetheart," Ryan said softly, setting his mug down and moving to open the door. There stood Linda Dawson, her clipboard clutched against her chest, and her expression professionally neutral, her gray suit as crisp as her demeanor. "Officer Mitchell," she greeted with a slight nod. "Come in," Ryan replied, stepping aside to allow the social worker entry. His stomach churned with unease as Linda's heels clicked against the hardwood floor, each step echoing like a countdown timer in his mind, and he watched as she settled onto the couch, glancing over at Ella, who had retreated to the corner of the room, clearly unsettled by the visitor's presence. She pressed herself against the wall, making herself as small as possible. "We need to talk about Ella's case," Linda said, flipping through the papers on her clipboard, the rustling sound filling the tense silence. Ryan's jaw tightened, bracing himself for the news he knew was coming. "The state is reviewing whether you're a suitable guardian," Linda continued, her words hanging heavy in the air like storm clouds about to break. "I already have temporary custody," Ryan countered, his voice sharp, though he forced himself to lower it, conscious of Ella's watchful eyes. His fingers dug into his palms, leaving half-moon marks on his skin. "Yes," Linda admitted, adjusting her glasses with one manicured finger. "But the system favors long-term foster care or adoption through approved families, single-parent households, especially with demanding careers like yours." She left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear in her carefully chosen words. Ryan felt a surge of frustration rise in his chest, his hands clasping tightly as he leaned forward. The coffee in his abandoned mug had grown cold. "She was in the system before. It failed her," he argued, his voice tinged with desperation. "Someone just abandoned her on a street corner, Linda. The system lost track of her completely. Do you know what that does to a child?" "I understand your concerns," Linda said, her tone softening slightly, a crack in her professional veneer. "But there are protocols we have to follow. The court needs to see that you can provide a stable environment." "And what's stable about shuffling her through more foster homes?" Ryan countered, his brow furrowed in concern. His police training helped him maintain composure, but inside he was seething. "She's already showing signs of trauma, food hoarding, separation anxiety." "I know you care about her, Ryan," Linda interrupted gently, her pen tapping against the clipboard. "But this isn't up to me. The court will want to see documentation, home studies, character references." Movement in the corner of his eye caught Ryan's attention, and he glanced over to see Ella peeking around the corner, her small fingers white-knuckled around her rabbit's ears, the stuffed animal's worn fur bearing witness to countless moments of anxiety. Her eyes darted between them, wide with fear, and Ryan knew she could sense the tension, even if she didn't fully understand the words being exchanged. The sight of her there, so vulnerable and scared, made his heart ache. Ryan clenched his jaw, fighting back the words he desperately wanted to say. Over my dead body will she be taken from me again? Instead, he swallowed hard, tasting the bitterness of words unsaid. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Ryan led Ella toward the local park. Her tiny hand gripped his tightly, her well-worn stuffed rabbit dangling from her other arm, its floppy ears swaying with each step. The playground buzzed with life, children laughing, parents chatting, the rhythmic creak of swing chains, and the soft thud of feet on wooden platforms. The air carried the sweet scent of fallen leaves and distant barbecue smoke. Ryan felt Ella press closer to his leg as they approached, her small fingers tightening around his. He understood her hesitation. After being abandoned and alone for so long, crowds must feel overwhelming, like waves threatening to sweep her away. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, a silent promise of protection. The warmth of her tiny palm against his reminded him of how far they'd come since those first frightened days. "You want to try the swings?" he asked softly, nodding toward the row of empty seats swaying gently in the breeze. Their red rubber seats gleamed invitingly in the afternoon sun, casting small shadows that danced on the ground below. Ella shook her head quickly, stepping behind his leg until only her wide, anxious eyes peeked out, her rabbit clutched protectively against her chest. "That's okay," Ryan assured her, keeping his voice calm and steady. "We can just watch for a while." He felt her relax slightly at his words, her grip loosening just a fraction. They settled onto a wooden bench near the playground, its weathered slats warm from the sun. Ryan noticed how Ella's eyes followed each child that ran past, studying their movements with careful attention, like a scientist observing a fascinating experiment. Her grip on his hand never loosened, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. Every now and then, she'd flinch at a particularly loud shout or sudden movement. A little girl with bouncing pigtails squealed with delight as her father pushed her higher on the swings, her pink dress fluttering in the wind. Her laughter rang out across the playground like bells. Ryan felt Ella shift beside him, her head tilting as she watched the scene unfold, something wistful in her expression. Her free hand absently stroked her rabbit's worn ear, a self-soothing gesture he'd come to recognize. Minutes ticked by in comfortable silence. Ryan didn't push or pressure her. He simply let her observe at her own pace, feeling her gradually relax beside him, her rigid posture softening degree by degree. The afternoon sun painted everything in warm golden light, and a gentle breeze carried the sound of rustling leaves. Then he felt a small tug on his sleeve, tentative but determined. Looking down, he saw Ella pointing toward the swings, her expression a mix of fear and longing, like someone staring at both a dream and a nightmare. Her bottom lip trembled slightly, but there was a spark of courage in her eyes. "Would you like to try?" Ryan asked gently, careful to keep any pressure from his voice. He watched her face closely, ready to backtrack at the slightest sign of distress. Ella nodded, though uncertainty still clouded her features like morning mist. Ryan stood slowly, letting her set the pace as they walked to the empty swing set, their footsteps crunching on the playground mulch. With careful movements, he lifted her onto the rubber seat, making sure she had a good grip on the chains, his hands hovering nearby for security. The metal links felt cool against her small palms. For a moment, panic flashed across her face like lightning. Her knuckles went white around the chains, and Ryan worried he'd pushed too fast. But then something magical happened. Her lips curved up into a small, hesitant smile, like the sun peeking through storm clouds. The tension in her shoulders began to melt away. "Ready?" he asked. When she nodded, he gave her the gentlest of pushes. The swing moved forward, and Ella's smile grew wider, more confident. Each push brought more joy spreading across her face, until her eyes sparkled with delight. The autumn breeze ruffled her hair, and for the first time, Ryan heard something that sounded almost like a giggle escape her lips. Later that evening, Ryan tucked Ella into her makeshift bed on the couch, the soft glow of the nightlight casting gentle shadows on the walls. She looked drowsy, but content, her stuffed rabbit clutched close to her chest like a treasure. The day's excitement had painted her cheeks with a healthy pink glow. As he smoothed the blanket around her shoulders, she mumbled something so quietly he almost missed it, her words floating like whispers on the evening air. Ryan leaned closer, his heart quickening. "What was that, sweetheart?" "Love you, Dada," she whispered, her eyes already drifting closed, peaceful and trusting. Her small hand reached out to touch his arm, as if making sure he was still there. Ryan's heart seemed to stop in his chest, the world narrowing to this single precious moment. His throat tightened with emotion as he stared at this precious little girl who'd been through so much, who'd been abandoned and forgotten, yet still had so much love to give, like a flower blooming through concrete. The streetlight outside cast a soft glow through the curtains, illuminating her peaceful face. "I love you too, sweetheart," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He stayed there for a long moment, watching her chest rise and fall with steady breaths, overwhelmed by the miracle of this small person who'd somehow found her way into his heart. Ryan stood at the kitchen counter, whisking eggs in a bowl while the morning sun streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across the tile floor. The familiar rhythm of making breakfast had become comforting over the past few days, a small piece of normalcy in their new routine. The gentle scrape of the whisk against the bowl mixed with the soft sounds of Ella's crayons at the table, where she sat carefully coloring in a picture he'd printed for her. Her tongue poked out slightly in concentration as she worked. His phone buzzed on the counter, Linda Dawson's name flashing on the screen. Ryan's hand hesitated for a moment, his stomach tightening with instinctive worry before answering. "Officer Mitchell speaking," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Linda's voice came through tight and serious. "Ryan, we found someone. Ella's biological father." The whisk clattered against the bowl, the sound making Ella jump slightly. Ryan's whole body went rigid, his fingers gripping the counter's edge. "Her father?" "Yes," Linda said, her tone carefully neutral. "His name is David Lawson. He's claiming he never knew she existed. Says he just found out about her existence last week." Ryan's fingers gripped the phone harder, his knuckles turning white. A sick feeling settled in his stomach like a lead weight. "And now he wants custody?" "He's filing for it," Linda confirmed. "And legally, he has rights. We have to consider his petition." Ryan's blood ran cold. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too confined, the walls seeming to press in around him. He glanced over at Ella, still focused on her coloring, her small hand carefully staying within the lines. She was completely unaware that her world might be about to change again. "How?" Ryan demanded, keeping his voice low and stepping further away from the table. "Where has he been all this time? Why now?" "He says he just found out about her," Linda explained, sighing. "He's been incarcerated. But he's out now, and he wants to be involved in her life. Says he wants to make things right." Ryan's jaw clenched so tight it hurt, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "Incarcerated? And you're telling me he has rights?" "The law is complicated, Ryan. If he can prove he's rehabilitated and capable of providing a stable home, the courts tend to favor biological parents in these situations." "Stable home?" Ryan cut in, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "She already has a stable home. Here, with me. She's finally settling in, Linda. Finally feeling safe." He watched as Ella looked up from her coloring, her big eyes catching his, sensing his tension. She clutched her stuffed rabbit closer to her chest, a habit she fell into whenever she felt uncertain. The sight made his heart ache. "I understand how you feel," Linda said softly, genuine sympathy in her voice. "But we have to follow proper procedures. Mr. Lawson will need to be evaluated, and there will be hearings. Nothing's decided yet." "She's been abandoned twice already," Ryan interrupted, running a hand through his hair. Twice, Linda. And now some stranger wants to waltz in and claim her. Someone who's been in prison? We'll need to schedule a meeting to discuss the next steps, Linda continued professionally. I'll send you the details later today. Try to stay calm until then, Ryan. Ryan ended the call, his hands shaking with anger and fear. He looked over at Ella on the couch, hugging her stuffed rabbit tight, her small fingers buried in its soft fur. She'd finally started to feel safe, finally begun to trust that she wouldn't be left again. She was starting to smile more, to let her guard down. She was healing. And now some stranger, some criminal wanted to take her away. Over my dead body. The thought came with absolute certainty, settling into his bones like steel. Ryan's living room felt suffocating as he paced back and forth, his coffee growing cold in the mug he gripped too tightly. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, but they couldn't match the darkness and turmoil swirling within his heart. Linda Dawson sat solemnly on his couch, her expression grim as she flipped through a thick manila folder. The rustling of papers with each turn sounded like sandpaper against Ryan's frayed nerves, heightening the tension in the room. "Ryan, I won't sugarcoat this," Linda said, looking up from the file with a heavy sigh. "David Lawson is petitioning for full custody of Ella." Ryan stopped pacing, his jaw clenching with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Where has he been for the last 3 years?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Linda closed the folder, her own expression reflecting the gravity of the situation. "That's the problem. He was incarcerated for drug possession, but he got out 6 months ago and just recently discovered Ella's existence." "He was in prison," Ryan's voice came out strained, barely controlled. "And now he thinks he can just swoop in and claim her as his own?" "The law favors biological parents, Ryan," Linda replied, her tone laced with sympathy, yet her words cutting like a cold, sharp blade. "Unless we can prove he's unfit, you might lose Ella." Ryan's pulse thundered in his ears and he set down the mug, his hand trembling slightly. His police training had taught him to remain calm in crisis situations, but this was no ordinary crisis. This was about the little girl who had captured his heart. What kind of system gives a convicted felon priority over? Ryan trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Over him? A cop who had only known Ella for a short time, but had already come to care for her deeply. Linda shuffled the papers in her hands, her movements deliberate and measured. "I understand your frustration, Ryan, but legally speaking—" "Legally speaking," Ryan interjected, his voice rising slightly before he reined in his emotions. "She was abandoned, twice, and now some stranger with a criminal record wants to waltz in and—" A small movement in the hallway caught his eye, and Ryan glanced over to see Ella peeking around the corner, her big brown eyes wide and uncertain, one hand clutching her beloved stuffed rabbit. The sight of her innocent, vulnerable form only fueled Ryan's determination. Over my dead body, he swore silently. He would not let Ella go without a fight. Ryan's fingers flew across the keyboard, his eyes scanning through endless documents and records. The soft glow of his laptop screen illuminated his tired face in the dimly lit home office, casting shadows under his eyes from another sleepless night of searching. Every few minutes, he'd glance at the doorway, making sure Ella was still safely playing with her stuffed rabbit in the living room, the sound of her quiet humming reassuring him. Nothing. He'd found almost nothing concrete on David Lawson that could help his case. His frustration mounted with each dead end, each useless document making his shoulders tense further. Running his hands through his hair, Ryan grabbed his phone and dialed a familiar number, his fingers trembling slightly with barely contained anxiety. "Jake Reynolds," came the gruff answer, the voice familiar and comforting in its directness. "Jake, it's Ryan Mitchell. I need your help." Ryan's voice was tight with urgency, almost cracking with worry. "Mitchell? Haven't heard from you in a while. What's going on?" Ryan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I need everything you can dig up on a David Lawson. Arrest records, complaints, anything that might show he's unfit to be a father. Even the smallest detail could help." There was a pause on the other end, filled with understanding. "This about that little girl you're taking care of?" "Yes," Her biological father wants custody, but something doesn't feel right. He was in prison, Jake. Now suddenly he wants to play daddy? The timing feels off. Jake sighed heavily. You really think this guy's dangerous? Ryan's jaw clenched as he stared at his screen, his free hand curling into a fist. I know he is. I just have to prove it. My gut's screaming at me about this one. Give me an hour, Jake said before hanging up, his tone promising thoroughness. Ryan spent that hour pacing, wearing a path in the carpet, checking on Ella every few minutes. She had fallen asleep on the couch, her tiny form curled around her beloved rabbit, one thumb tucked near her mouth. The sight made his heart ache with fierce protectiveness. When his phone finally rang, Ryan snatched it up before the first ring ended, nearly dropping it in his haste. Mitchell. Jake's voice was grim, setting off warning bells. You were right. This guy has a rap sheet longer than Route 66, and none of it's pretty. Ryan's stomach dropped, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. Tell me. Multiple assault charges over the past decade, 3 different restraining orders from an ex-girlfriend, substance abuse issues, mostly meth and cocaine. The prison stint wasn't his first either. He's been in and out since his 20s. The pattern shows escalating violence. Ice spread through Ryan's veins as he wrote everything down, his handwriting barely legible in his rush. Send me everything you've got. I need documentation. Every scrap you can find. Already on its way to your email, but Ryan? Jake paused, concern evident in his voice. Be careful. This guy's got a history of violence when he doesn't get his way. He doesn't take no for an answer. Ryan walked to the living room doorway, watching Ella's peaceful sleep. Her chest rose and fell softly, her face finally relaxed after so many nights of nightmares. She looked so small, so vulnerable, her dark curls falling across her forehead. One tiny hand clutched her rabbit while the other lay palm up, trusting and innocent. Thanks, Jake, I owe you one, a big one. After hanging up, Ryan stood there for a long moment, his heart heavy with the weight of what he'd learned. This wasn't just about keeping custody anymore. This was about protecting Ella from a man who could hurt her, who could destroy the fragile sense of safety she'd finally found. He walked over and gently tucked her blanket more securely around her shoulders, brushing a soft kiss against her forehead. This wasn't just a custody battle anymore. This was a fight for her life, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The alternative was unthinkable. The courtroom's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the polished wooden benches, creating an almost clinical atmosphere in the usually dignified space. Ryan sat rigid in his chair, his police uniform crisp and neat, though his collar felt suffocating. Beside him, Ella's small hand clutched his tightly, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her other arm, its worn fur a testament to countless nights of comfort. His lawyer, Michael Grant, arranged papers on the table before them, occasionally glancing at Ryan with reassuring nods. The sharp rustle of documents seemed to echo in the tense silence. The courtroom door creaked open, and Ryan's heart stopped, his breath catching in his throat. David Lawson strode in, wearing an ill-fitting suit that hung loose on his thin frame, the sleeves slightly frayed at the edges. His hollow eyes darted around the room before landing on Ella, and something predatory flickered in their depths. A smirk crossed his face as he looked at Ryan, and Ryan felt his muscles tense, years of police training screaming warnings in his mind. Everything about the man set off his cop instincts, from his calculated movements to his practiced expression of contrition. Linda Dawson sat in the gallery, her expression carefully neutral as she watched the proceedings unfold, her notebook balanced precisely on her crossed legs. David's lawyer stood first, smoothing his tie with manicured fingers. Your Honor, my client has made remarkable progress. He's completed rehabilitation, maintained steady employment, and deserves the opportunity to raise his biological daughter. The bond between father and child is sacred, and Mr. Lawson was denied this chance through unfortunate circumstances. His voice carried the practiced smoothness of someone used to defending difficult cases. Michael Grant rose next, his voice steady and firm, his shoulders squared with determination. Your Honor, Officer Mitchell has provided a stable, loving home for Ella. Mr. Lawson, on the other hand, has a documented history of violence. The child doesn't know him, has never met him. Placing her in his custody would be traumatic. His words carried the weight of genuine concern rather than mere legal argument. Because I never got the chance. David's voice boomed across the courtroom, echoing off the high ceiling. Ella jumped in her seat, pressing closer to Ryan's side, trembling slightly. Her tiny fingers dug into his arm through the sleeve of his uniform. Ryan's hands clenched into fists under the table, his knuckles white with restraint. He wanted nothing more than to wipe that smug look off Lawson's face, to protect Ella from this man who thought he could waltz in and claim her like property. The protective instinct that had served him well as a police officer now burned like fire in his chest. The judge, an older woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, leaned forward in her chair, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. Her eyes moved between both parties, studying them carefully, weighing each detail. This is a complex situation that requires careful consideration. I will need further evidence before making any decisions. She shuffled some papers, then continued, her tone measured and deliberate. I'm ordering a full evaluation. Social workers will assess both homes, Officer Mitchell's current living situation and Mr. Lawson's proposed arrangement. We need to determine what truly serves the child's best interests. Her words fell like heavy stones in the quiet courtroom. Ryan felt ice spread through his veins, a cold dread seeping into his bones. They were actually considering it. They might give Ella to this man, this stranger with hollow eyes who made her flinch at the sound of his voice. The thought made his stomach churn. He looked down at Ella, who had buried her face against his arm, clutching her rabbit like a shield against the world. Her small frame shook with each careful breath. The thought of her being taken away, being placed in that man's custody, made him feel physically ill. Every fiber of his being screamed against the possibility. The judge's gavel cracked through the air like a gunshot, making Ella jump again, her grip tightening impossibly further. We'll reconvene after the home studies are complete. Court adjourned. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the silent courtroom as Ryan adjusted his tie for the 100th time. His palms felt clammy, and his heart wouldn't stop racing. The familiar weight of his police badge in his pocket offered little comfort today. Across the aisle, David Lawson lounged in his chair with an arrogant smile that made Ryan's stomach turn. The man's freshly pressed suit and carefully styled hair couldn't mask the coldness in his eyes. Linda Dawson approached the witness stand, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She smoothed her skirt and took her seat, facing Judge Hayes with practiced composure. The social worker's familiar face showed hints of tension around her eyes, betraying the gravity of the moment. Ms. Dawson, please share your findings regarding Ella's current living situation, the judge requested, adjusting her reading glasses. Linda cleared her throat. After extensive observation, I can confirm that Ella is thriving under Officer Mitchell's care. She's gaining weight, sleeping through the night, and showing healthy attachment behaviors. She calls him Dada and seeks his comfort when distressed. The child who once hoarded food and flinched at sudden movements now laughs freely and shows remarkable progress in therapy. She paused, glancing between Ryan and David. However, I must acknowledge that legally, biological parent rights carry significant weight in these cases. The law requires us to consider family reunification whenever possible. David's lawyer stood, straightening his expensive suit. His gold cufflinks caught the harsh lighting as he gestured. Your Honor, blood ties cannot be dismissed. Mr. Lawson deserves the opportunity to know his daughter. He's completed all required parenting classes and maintains steady employment. Ryan's lawyer rose quickly. Your Honor, if I may? At the judge's nod, he continued. Mr. Lawson's history of violence cannot be ignored. We have documentation of multiple assault charges and substance abuse. Would the court really consider placing a vulnerable child in such an environment? Officer Mitchell has provided a stable, loving home for nearly 8 months now. Judge Hayes turned her stern gaze to David. Mr. Lawson, have you had any contact with your daughter before these proceedings? David shifted in his chair, his smug expression faltering. Sweat beaded on his forehead. No, Your Honor. Have you provided any financial support? No, he mumbled, looking down at his manicured hands. The courtroom fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, a small voice broke through. I don't want to go. Ella tugged on Ryan's sleeve, her brown eyes wide with fear as she looked up at Judge Hayes. Her favorite stuffed elephant was clutched tightly against her chest. The judge's expression softened as she leaned forward. Ella, sweetheart, who makes you feel safe? Without hesitation, Ella wrapped both arms around Ryan's, pressing close against him. Her dark curls brushed against his shoulder as she buried her face in his suit jacket. Dada, she said firmly, her voice small but certain. Ryan blinked back tears, his throat tight with emotion. He gently squeezed Ella's hand, trying to convey that everything would be okay, even as doubt gnawed at his own heart. The memory of Claire and their shared dream of adopting Ella felt especially raw in this moment. Judge Hayes straightened in her chair, her years of experience evident in her measured tone. I will take 24 hours to review all evidence and testimony before making my final decision. She struck her gavel. Court is adjourned until tomorrow at 10 a.m. Ryan exhaled shakily, gathering Ella into his arms. She instinctively wrapped her legs around his waist, clinging to him like a lifeline. One more day of uncertainty. One more day until they knew if their family would stay together or be torn apart. The weight of those hours stretched before them like an eternity. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as Ryan sat at the table, surrounded by stacks of legal papers. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten among the mess of custody documents and case files. The dim light from above cast long shadows across the kitchen, matching his dark mood. Empty takeout containers from dinner were pushed to one side, evidence of another night when cooking had been the last thing on his mind. Come on, he muttered, flipping through another page of legal jargon. His lawyer's words from earlier that day kept echoing in his mind. It's a toss-up, Ryan. The judge could go either way. The uncertainty made his stomach churn. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, knocking over a pen in the process. The screen showed 11 p.m., but he knew Jake would still be up. The detective answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the weight of too many late-night conversations like this one. I need something, Jake, anything, Ryan said, his voice tight with desperation. If I lose tomorrow, she'll be in that man's custody. The very thought made bile rise in his throat. He heard Jake's heavy sigh through the phone. I already ran everything I could, but Ryan, if the judge sees him as rehabilitated, she might give him a chance. The words hung in the air like a bad omen. Ryan's grip on his pen tightened until the plastic creaked. Ella isn't some chance he gets to redeem himself with. She's a kid, my kid. The last two words came out fierce and protective. A small sound from the hallway made him look up. Ella stood there in her pink pajamas, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Her stuffed rabbit dragged on the floor beside her, one ear slightly frayed from constant companionship. Dada? Her voice was small and uncertain, a reminder of everything he stood to lose. Ryan quickly softened his expression, forcing a smile he didn't feel. It's okay, sweetheart. Go back to sleep. He wanted to go to her, hold her close, promise that everything would be all right. She lingered for a moment, then padded back down the dark hallway. Ryan waited until he couldn't hear her footsteps anymore before closing his eyes. His hand found Claire's old engagement ring in his pocket. He'd started carrying it again lately, like a talisman. The metal was warm from being held so often. I won't fail her, Claire, he whispered, clutching the ring tightly. Not this time. The promise felt like both a prayer and a declaration of war. The house fell silent except for the steady tick of the clock. Ryan stayed at the table, surrounded by his papers, preparing for the fight of his life. Tomorrow would decide everything, and he wasn't about to let Ella down. The courthouse doors felt heavy as Ryan pushed them open. Ella's tiny hand gripped tightly in his. Her blue dress rustled softly with each step, her stuffed rabbit tucked securely under her arm. The morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The familiar scent of wood polish and paper filled the air, mingling with the faint echo of footsteps in the hallway. David Lawson sat at the opposite table, leaning back with an air of casual confidence. His smirk made Ryan's stomach turn. He wore an expensive suit that seemed calculated to impress, his hands folded neatly on the table. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Margaret Hayes presiding. The judge settled into her chair, her expression neutral as she surveyed the courtroom. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "This is the final custody hearing for minor child Ella Lawson," she announced, her voice steady and clear. Ryan's fingers tightened on the wooden table before him, his knuckles turning white. The weight of everything at stake pressed down on his shoulders. David's lawyer rose first, straightening his tie with manicured fingers. "Your Honor, my client has shown remarkable progress. Mr. Lawson has completed rehabilitation, secured steady employment, and is fully prepared to take on the responsibilities of fatherhood." He gestured toward David, who sat up straighter, wearing an expression of practiced remorse. "Blood ties are fundamental in custody cases. Every child deserves to know their biological parent." Michael Grant, Ryan's lawyer, stood next. His voice carried conviction, resonating through the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor, parenthood isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who shows up. Mr. Mitchell has been there for Ella when no one else was. He's been her caretaker, her provider, and her protector. He's the one who reads her bedtime stories, tends to her nightmares, and makes her feel safe." The tension in the room grew thicker as David suddenly spoke up, addressing the judge directly. His voice carried a practiced sincerity that made Ryan's jaw clench. A muscle twitched in his cheek as he fought to maintain composure. "I know I made mistakes, Your Honor, but I want to be better. She deserves to know her real father." Ryan couldn't stay silent any longer. He stood, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "She already does." His eyes met the judge's sharp gaze, which moved between both men with careful consideration. Ella pressed closer against his leg, her small body trembling slightly. Judge Hayes adjusted her glasses, taking in the scene before her. Ella pressed closer to Ryan's side, her small fingers gripping his pant leg, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. The judge's expression remained unreadable as she spoke, her words measured and deliberate. "I will review all evidence presented and make my ruling by the end of the day." Ryan's heart pounded against his ribs as the judge gathered her papers. Sweat beaded on the back of his neck as he gently squeezed Ella's hand. The waiting would begin, and with it, the longest hours of his life. The future hung suspended in the balance of one woman's decision. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Ryan's living room windows, but he barely noticed. He sat motionless on the couch, his shoulders tight with tension. The wall clock's steady ticking felt like tiny hammers against his skull. 3 o'clock. Still no word from the judge. Ella sat cross-legged on the carpet, carefully arranging her stuffed animals in a circle. Every few minutes she'd glance up at him with those big brown eyes, as if checking to make sure he was still there. The sight made his chest ache. His phone buzzed and Ryan snatched it up so quickly he nearly dropped it. Michael Grant's name flashed on the screen. "Any news?" Ryan's voice came out rough. "Still no ruling," his lawyer replied, sounding tired. "Judge Hayes is being thorough." Ryan's free hand clenched into a fist. What if she sides with him? The pause on the other end of the line stretched too long. "Then we appeal," Michael said finally. "We fight." What if we don't win? The words felt like glass in his throat. The thought of losing Ella, of her being handed over to that man. A small tug on his sleeve interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Ella stood beside him, her face pinched with concern. "Dada sad?" Ryan quickly softened his expression, unclenching his fist. "No, sweetheart. Just thinking." Ella studied his face with that eerily perceptive gaze of hers. Then, without a word, she climbed into his lap and wrapped her little arms around his neck. Her rabbit dangled forgotten from one hand as she hugged him tight. Ryan closed his eyes, breathing in the sweet baby shampoo smell of her hair. His arms encircled her protectively, holding her close. She felt so small, so fragile against his chest. How could anyone think of taking her away? The sharp ring of his phone cut through the quiet moment. Ryan's entire body went rigid. This was it. Ryan paced his living room, wearing a path in the carpet. His phone felt heavy in his hand, Michael Grant's words echoing in his head like a death sentence. "The judge is leaning toward granting David joint custody," Michael said, his voice tight with concern. "What?" Ryan's stomach plummeted. He gripped the phone harder, struggling to keep his voice steady. "She's considering a transition plan, limited visitation leading to shared custody." Ryan's hands trembled as he looked over at Ella. She sat quietly on the floor, carefully stacking blocks into a wobbly tower, completely unaware that her world might shatter again. With shaking fingers, he dialed Jake Reynolds' number. "Jake, I need something, anything before the ruling." A heavy sigh crackled through the line. "Ryan, we've pulled everything." Ryan ran his fingers through his hair, desperation clawing at his chest. There had to be something they missed. Anything. Then Jake's voice changed. "Wait. What?" An ex-girlfriend filed a domestic violence complaint against David 6 months ago. Jake paused. "It was dismissed due to lack of evidence." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. "Can you get me her number?" Jake texted the contact information immediately. Ryan didn't waste a second, hitting dial before the message notification faded from his screen. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice cautious. "Hello? This is Officer Ryan Mitchell. I need to ask you about David Lawson." The silence that followed felt endless. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with barely contained fear. "He shouldn't be near a child." Ryan's pulse quickened. "Can you testify?" The pause stretched on, each second an eternity. Finally, her quiet response. "Yes." With renewed hope surging through him, Ryan immediately called his lawyer back. "I have something. We can stop this." Michael's voice sharpened with interest. "Then let's go." Ryan paced his home office, the phone pressed tightly against his ear. His heart hammered in his chest as Michael's voice crackled through the speaker. "You're sure about this witness?" Michael asked. "Absolutely. Sarah Williams filed a domestic violence report against David 6 months ago." Ryan ran a hand through his hair. "The case was dismissed, but she's willing to testify about what he did." "This could be exactly what we need," Michael said, his voice gaining energy. "If we can prove he's violent, the judge won't risk putting Ella in his custody." Ryan stopped at his window, watching the setting sun paint the sky orange. "Can we get an emergency hearing tomorrow?" "I'll file the motion right now," Michael replied. "But Ryan, we need this woman there. Without her testimony, it's just hearsay." "I'll handle it," Ryan said firmly, ending the call. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed Sarah Williams's number. Each ring felt like an eternity until a soft, hesitant voice answered. "Hello? Ms. Williams? This is Officer Ryan Mitchell. I need to talk to you about David Lawson." There was a long pause. I don't want to get involved," she said quietly. "You don't know what he's capable of." "Please," Ryan's voice cracked slightly. "There's a little girl's life at stake. My daughter. He's trying to take her away." The silence stretched between them. Ryan could hear Sarah's shaky breathing. "He shouldn't be anywhere near a child," she finally whispered. "The things he did." "Then help me stop him," Ryan pleaded. "Just tell the judge what happened. That's all I'm asking." Another pause. Ryan held his breath. "Okay," Sarah said softly. "I'll be there. For that little girl." Relief flooded through Ryan's body. "Thank you. My lawyer will contact you with the details." After ending the call, Ryan closed his laptop and walked to the living room. The sight that greeted him made his heart ache. Ella lay curled up on the couch, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. Her eyes were heavy with sleep, but they tracked his movement as he approached. Ryan knelt beside the couch, gently brushing her hair away from her face. "I won't let anyone take you away," he whispered. Ella blinked up at him sleepily. "Promise?" Ryan's voice was firm and unwavering. "Promise." Ryan lay in his darkened bedroom, the digital clock's red numbers casting a dim glow. 11:30 p.m. Sleep refused to come. His mind raced with thoughts of tomorrow's court hearing, of Sarah's testimony, of everything that could go wrong. The ceiling above seemed to press down on him, matching the weight in his chest. He shifted restlessly, the sheets tangling around his legs. The house felt too quiet, too still. Even the usual creaks and settling sounds seemed muted, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Finally, giving up on sleep, Ryan swung his legs over the side of the bed. The hardwood floor felt cool beneath his feet as he padded down the hallway to Ella's room. The door was cracked open, just as she liked it. Moonlight spilled through her window, casting a soft glow across her small form. She looked so peaceful, curled up under her blanket, one tiny hand clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her dark hair fanned across the pillow and her chest rose and fell with steady breaths. Ryan knelt beside her bed, his heart aching. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I should have found you sooner," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The words carried all his regret, all his fear, all his love. Ella stirred slightly in her sleep, her small fingers instinctively reaching out and curling into his sleeve. Even unconscious, she sought his presence, his protection. Ryan's throat tightened painfully. He stayed there, watching her sleep, memorizing every detail of her face. The slight curve of her cheek, the flutter of her eyelashes, the way her nose scrunched up slightly as she dreamed. His daughter. Not by blood, but by something deeper, something that couldn't be measured in DNA or legal documents. The thought of losing her tomorrow made his chest constrict. The idea of David Lawson having any claim to her life, any power over her future, made his stomach turn. Ryan had seen the darkness in that man's eyes, the hollow promises of change that rang false. Ella deserved better. She deserved safety, stability, and love. She deserved a father who would move heaven and earth to protect her, not one who saw her as a chance at redemption. Ryan closed his eyes, bowing his head. A silent prayer formed in his heart, not elaborate or eloquent, just a desperate plea for protection, for justice, for the chance to keep his daughter safe. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Ryan sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, his police uniform pressed and pristine. Ella's small hand felt warm in his, her stuffed rabbit tucked safely in her lap. She wore the blue dress they'd picked out together, her hair neatly braided. The courtroom doors opened with a heavy creak. David Lawson strode in, wearing an ill-fitting suit and a confident smirk. He nodded at his lawyer before taking his seat, shooting Ryan a triumphant glance. Ryan's jaw tightened, but he kept his focus straight ahead. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Margaret Hayes entered, her black robes flowing as she took her place at the bench. "Be seated," she commanded, her voice carrying authority through the hushed room. David's lawyer rose first, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, my client has shown remarkable improvement. He's maintained steady employment, completed rehabilitation, and deserves the opportunity to know his daughter." He gestured toward David, who put on his best reformed man expression. Michael Grant, Ryan's lawyer, stood next. "Your Honor, before you make your decision, we have critical new evidence regarding Mr. Lawson's character." The judge nodded, and Sarah Williams was called to the stand. Sarah approached slowly, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked anywhere but at David as she took her oath. Ryan could see her trembling as she sat down. "Ms. Williams," Michael began gently, "please tell the court about your relationship with David Lawson." Sarah's voice started soft but grew stronger. "I dated David 6 months ago after he got out of prison. At first he seemed changed, but then..." She took a shaky breath. "He has a temper. When things don't go his way, he gets violent. He pushed me downstairs. He threatened worse if I told anyone." David's face darkened. He suddenly lunged from his chair, his mask of civility cracking. "You're lying," he shouted, pointing an accusatory finger. "She's making this up." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Ella flinched, pressing closer to Ryan's side. He wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders. "Order!" Judge Hayes slammed her gavel. "Mr. Lawson, sit down immediately." Her stern voice cut through the chaos. David slowly sank back into his chair, but his eyes blazed with barely contained rage. The judge turned her piercing gaze on David, studying him with new understanding. "I've heard enough," she declared, her voice cold and firm. Ryan felt his heart hammering against his ribs as Judge Hayes straightened her papers. Ella's tiny fingers tightened around his hand. "I am ready to issue my ruling," the judge announced, looking between the two men. Ryan held his breath, pulling Ella closer. Everything they'd built together, every moment of trust they'd earned, every smile and dada whispered in the dark, it all hung in the balance of the next few words. The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Ryan's heart thundered in his chest as Judge Hayes adjusted her glasses, shuffling the papers before her. The courtroom fell silent, heavy with anticipation. "This has been a difficult case," Judge Hayes began, her voice steady and clear. "However, after reviewing all evidence, including testimony, I have come to a decision." Ryan's breath caught in his throat. Beside him, Ella clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, her small fingers wrapped around his hand. The ticking of the wall clock seemed deafening in the silence. Judge Hayes turned her stern gaze toward David Lawson, who sat with an air of entitlement. "Mr. Lawson, your history of violence is deeply concerning. I cannot, in good conscience, place this child in your care." David's face drained of color. "But," he started to protest, half rising from his chair. The judge held up her hand, silencing him. Her expression softened as she turned to Ryan. "Officer Mitchell, you have demonstrated commitment, love, and stability. Therefore, I am awarding you full legal custody of Ella Mitchell." The weight of 3 years lifted from Ryan's shoulders. His vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall. The courtroom seemed to spin around him as relief flooded his body. "Dada?" Ella's small voice brought him back to the present. She looked up at him with those big brown eyes, confusion written across her face. Ryan lifted her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. He could feel her tiny heartbeat against his. "We did it, baby girl," he whispered into her hair. David slammed his chair back and stormed out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. But Ryan barely noticed. His world had narrowed to the precious weight in his arms. Judge Hayes allowed herself a small smile. "Take her home," she said gently. Ryan carried Ella out of the courthouse, each step lighter than the last. This time, she was his forever. Ryan's hand hovered over the documents spread across his kitchen table, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the pen, staring at the blank signature line that would change everything. The name Ella Mitchell was typed neatly above, waiting to become real. His lawyer's voice crackled through the phone speaker. "All that's left is your signature, Ryan," Michael said softly. "Once you sign, she's officially Ella Mitchell." Ryan set the pen down, his chest tight with emotion. He glanced over at Ella, who sat cross-legged at the coffee table, her tiny hands gripping a crayon as she drew what looked like a house with 2 stick figures holding hands. "I need a minute, Michael," Ryan said into the phone. "Can I call you back?" "Of course, take your time." Ryan ended the call and walked over to where Ella sat. He lowered himself to her level, watching as she added a sun in the corner of her drawing. Her stuffed rabbit sat faithfully beside her, never far from reach. "Sweetheart," he said gently. Ella looked up, her big brown eyes meeting his. "Can we talk about something important?" She nodded, setting down her crayon. "You know those papers on the table?" Ryan gestured toward the kitchen. "They're about your name. Right now, your last name is Lawson. But you could change it. You could have my last name. Mitchell. Ella's forehead wrinkled slightly as she processed this. But I want you to choose, Ryan continued, his voice soft. If you want to keep your old name, that's okay. Or if you want to be Ella Mitchell, that's okay too. It's your choice, sweetheart. Ella was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her drawing. Then she pointed to the two stick figures. That's us, she said quietly. Yes, it is, Ryan smiled. We're family? She asked, her voice small but clear. Yes, we are. Forever. Ella asintió como si estuviera confirmándole algo a sí misma. Then she looked up at Ryan, her eyes bright and sure. I want to be Mitchell. Ryan felt his throat tighten with emotion. He pulled her into a gentle hug, and she wrapped her small arms around his neck. Like you, she whispered against his shoulder. With Ella still in his arms, Ryan reached for his phone and called Michael back. We're ready, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He carried Ella to the kitchen table and sat down with her in his lap. Taking the pen in hand, he signed his name on the line, making it official. Ella Mitchell, his daughter, fully, forever. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as Ryan stood in the doorway of Ella's temporary room. The bare walls and makeshift bed had served their purpose, but now it was time for something more permanent. Ella peeked around his legs, her small fingers gripping his jeans. Time to make this your space, kiddo, Ryan said with a smile. Ella's eyes widened, and she let out a tiny gasp of excitement. They started with the walls. Ryan opened a can of soft pastel pink paint, the same shade Claire had always loved. He showed Ella how to use the roller, helping her reach the lower parts of the wall while he handled the higher sections. Paint splattered their old clothes, but neither of them minded. Look, Dada, Ella giggled, showing him her pink-spotted hands. Ryan couldn't help but laugh, his heart warming at the sound of her joy. While the paint dried, they went shopping. Ella's eyes grew huge at the children's furniture store. She picked out a white bookshelf, just her size, and Ryan helped her choose books to fill it. They found glow-in-the-dark stars for the ceiling and a collection of stuffed animals to keep her rabbit company. Back home, Ryan assembled the furniture while Ella supervised, handing him tools and giggling when he pretended to be confused about which screwdriver to use. Together, they arranged everything just right, the bookshelf against one wall, a small desk by the window, and a proper bed with princess sheets Ella had chosen herself. One more thing, Ryan said, pulling out a wrapped package. Ella carefully opened it to reveal a framed photograph, one Linda had taken of them at the park last week. In it, Ryan was pushing Ella on the swing, both of them laughing. Your room, sweetheart. Forever, he whispered, hanging the photo where she could see it from her bed. That night, Ella snuggled into her new bed, surrounded by her stuffed animals and under the gentle glow of her star-covered ceiling. Ryan watched from the doorway as her eyes drifted closed, her breathing becoming steady and peaceful. For the first time since bringing her home, his house felt complete. It wasn't just his space anymore. It was their home, together. A piercing scream shattered the quiet night, jolting Ryan awake. His heart hammered against his ribs as he threw off his covers and sprinted down the hallway. The sound came from Ella's room, raw and terrified. He burst through her door to find her sitting up in bed, her tiny body shaking. Tears streamed down her face, and her stuffed rabbit lay forgotten on the floor. The moonlight filtering through her window cast shadows across her terror-stricken features. Ella, baby, Ryan said softly, crossing the room in 3 quick strides. He knelt beside her bed, and she immediately launched herself into his arms, her small fingers digging into his shirt. No go. No go, Dada, she sobbed, her voice muffled against his chest. The words hit Ryan like a physical blow. Even in her dreams, she feared being left behind, abandoned like before. His arms tightened around her protectively. Hey, sweetheart, it's okay. I'm here, he whispered, gently rocking her back and forth. Her whole body trembled against him, and he could feel her tears soaking through his shirt. I'm not going anywhere. Ever. Ella hiccuped, her grip on his shirt not loosening. Promise? she whimpered. "I promise, baby girl. You're stuck with me forever." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, continuing to rock her slowly. Her stuffed rabbit caught his eye, and he reached down to retrieve it, tucking it between them. Minutes passed as Ryan held her, humming softly, an old lullaby Claire used to sing. Gradually, Ella's sobs quieted to sniffles, and her death grip on his shirt relaxed. She curled into his chest, her breathing evening out. "That's it, sweetheart," he murmured, still rocking. "I've got you." He felt her growing heavier in his arms as sleep began to reclaim her. Even then, he didn't move, didn't try to put her back in bed. Instead, he settled more comfortably against her headboard, keeping her safe in his embrace. As Ella drifted off completely, Ryan whispered into the darkness, "You'll never be alone again, baby girl." The twinkling lights in shop windows caught Ella's attention as they walked past. Her small face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with wonder at the Christmas displays. Ryan watched her, his heart swelling. He knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "What do you want for Christmas, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Ella turned to him, her expression thoughtful. She fidgeted with the hem of her coat, then whispered, "Can we get a Christmas tree?" Ryan smiled warmly. "You bet we can." That afternoon, they visited the local Christmas tree lot. The scent of pine filled the air as they walked between rows of evergreens. Ella's eyes grew bigger with each tree they passed. Ryan watched as she carefully inspected each one, taking her role in choosing very seriously. "That one," she finally exclaimed, pointing to a tall Fraser fir that seemed to touch the sky. Ryan grinned. "The biggest one, huh?" He ruffled her hair. "Perfect choice." Back home, they spent hours decorating. Ryan lifted Ella onto his shoulders so she could hang ornaments on the higher branches. She giggled as he spun her around, carefully placing each bauble. The tree slowly transformed with twinkling lights, shimmering tinsel, and colorful ornaments. "Ready for the most important part?" Ryan asked, holding out the star. Ella nodded eagerly. Ryan lifted her up again, and with steady hands, she placed the star on top. When he set her down, she stepped back to admire their work, her face glowing with pride. As evening settled in, they sat together by the fireplace. The room was bathed in the warm glow of Christmas lights, casting soft shadows on the walls. Ella se acurrucó en el regazo de Ryan, su cabeza descansando contra su pecho. "Best Christmas ever," she murmured sleepily, her eyes growing heavy as she watched the twinkling lights. Ryan held her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. His throat tightened with emotion as he looked at their tree, at the home they'd created together. He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead as she drifted off to sleep, the Christmas lights casting a magical glow around them. She was home. She was safe. She was his. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty attic window as Ryan pulled down another cardboard box. Ella was napping downstairs, giving him time to finally tackle the cluttered storage space. He needed room for their new life together, her growing collection of artwork, the photos they'd taken, the memories they were building. His hands moved mechanically through the items, sorting what to keep and what to donate. Old college textbooks, a few framed photographs, Claire's favorite sweater that he could never bring himself to give away. The scent of her perfume still clung faintly to the fabric. Then his fingers brushed against something else, an envelope tucked between the pages of an old photo album. His heart stopped. He recognized the handwriting immediately, the elegant slope of Claire's letters, the way she always dotted her I's with tiny circles. The envelope was sealed, never opened. His name was written on the front in her familiar script. Ryan's hands trembled as he held it, wondering how long it had been here, waiting for him to find it. He sat heavily on an old trunk, staring at the envelope. Should he open it? Did he want to hear Claire's voice in his head again, now that he was finally healing? But something told him he needed to read these words. With shaking fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was cream-colored, Claire's favorite stationery. His vision blurred as he began to read, "Ryan, if you're reading this, it means something happened to me. I hope with everything in me that it didn't. But if it did, promise me you won't let this break you. You were meant to be a father. And that little girl, she was meant to be ours. If you ever find her again, don't be afraid to love her. She was always meant to be yours." The words hit him like a physical blow. A sob caught in his throat as he pressed the letter to his forehead, tears sliding down his cheeks. Even then, Claire had known. She'd seen what he was meant to be, even if he'd lost his way after losing her. That evening, after dinner and story time, Ryan stood in Ella's doorway, watching her peaceful, sleeping face. The moonlight cast a gentle glow across her features, making her look almost ethereal. Her stuffed rabbit was tucked securely under one arm, her other hand curled near her face. He moved quietly to her bedside, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I found her, Claire," he whispered into the quiet room. "And I'll never let her go." The January morning dawned crisp and clear as Ryan helped Ella into her new blue dress. His fingers trembled slightly as he buttoned the back, overwhelmed by the significance of this day. They'd waited so long for this moment. "Ready for our special day, sweetheart?" Ryan asked, smoothing Ella's hair. Ella nodded, clutching her beloved stuffed rabbit. "Forever day," she whispered, using the term they'd created together to help her understand what adoption meant. The courthouse stood tall and imposing against the winter sky, but today it felt different. Not intimidating, but welcoming. Their small group of supporters waited outside. Detective Jake Reynolds, Linda Dawson, and even Nurse Jessica from that first night at the hospital. They all smiled and waved as Ryan carried Ella up the steps. Inside the judge's chambers, the mood was intimate and warm. Judge Margaret Hayes, who had fought so hard to keep them together, sat behind her desk with a gentle smile. The morning light streaming through her window created a soft glow around the room. "Good morning, Ella," Judge Hayes said kindly. "You look beautiful today." Ella buried her face in Ryan's shoulder but peeked out with a small smile. Ryan rubbed her back gently, his heart thundering with anticipation. The judge picked up the adoption papers, reviewing them one final time. "Mr. Mitchell, are you ready to become Ella's legal father?" Ryan's voice came out strong and clear, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I've been ready since the moment I found her." Judge Hayes turned her attention to Ella, her voice soft and warm. "And sweetheart, do you want Ryan to be your daddy?" Ella levantó la cabeza, mirando directamente al juez. Without hesitation, she said clearly, "He already is." Ryan's breath caught in his throat. Tears pricked at his eyes as Judge Hayes picked up her pen with a broad smile. "Then by the power vested in me by the state, I hereby declare this adoption final and complete." The judge signed the papers with a flourish. "Ella Mitchell, you are officially adopted." Ryan couldn't contain himself. He lifted Ella high into the air, spinning her around as her giggles filled the chamber. Her blue dress twirled like a flower in bloom, and her eyes sparkled with pure joy. As he brought her back down into his arms, he whispered against her hair, "We did it, baby girl. You're mine forever." The photo studio was warm and inviting, filled with soft natural light streaming through large windows. Ryan helped Ella out of her winter coat, revealing the special dress they'd picked out together for the occasion. His heart swelled as she twirled, making the fabric swish around her knees. "Ready, sweetheart?" Ryan asked, kneeling to adjust her little jacket. His fingers smoothed down the collar with careful attention. Ella's eyes sparkled as she looked up at him. "Ready, Dada," she replied, bouncing slightly on her toes with excitement. The photographer, a kind-faced woman named Sarah, guided them to a simple backdrop. "Let's start with some casual shots," she suggested, adjusting her camera settings. "Just be natural with each other." Ryan lifted Ella onto his lap, and she immediately snuggled against his chest, a position that had become so familiar over their time together. As Sarah snapped photos, Ryan couldn't help but tickle Ella's sides, making her burst into delighted giggles. The camera clicked rapidly, capturing their genuine joy. "Perfect," Sarah exclaimed, showing them a preview on her camera screen. The image took Ryan's breath away, Ella's head thrown back in laughter, his own face lit up with pure happiness as he held her close. It was everything he'd hoped for. While Sarah prepared to print their chosen photos, Ryan reached for his wallet. His fingers brushed against the worn edge of the old photograph he'd carried for so long, the baby picture of Ella that had started their journey. He pulled it out, studying the faded image of the infant who should have been his daughter years ago. With gentle reverence, he tucked the old photo back into his wallet. It would always be part of their story, but now they had new memories to cherish. Sarah returned with their framed portrait, wrapped carefully in protective paper. Back home, Ryan stood in the living room, the new frame heavy in his hands. He hung it carefully on the wall beside Claire's photograph, stepping back to admire how perfectly they fit together. Ella's laughter from the new portrait seemed to echo through the room, bringing warmth to Claire's gentle smile in her frame. "We made it, Claire," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She's home." The soft glow of Ella's nightlight cast gentle shadows across her bedroom walls, where glow-in-the-dark stars twinkled above. Ryan sat on the edge of her bed, tucking the blanket snugly around her small frame. His fingers brushed a wayward strand of hair from her forehead with tender care. "Comfy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room. Ella nodded, her eyes already heavy with approaching sleep. "Yeah." Her small hand reached out, catching his larger one before he could move away. "No go now, Dada?" Ryan's throat tightened at those words. They brought him back to that first night, when she was just a scared little girl at a bus stop, afraid of being left behind again. He remembered how she'd clung to him then, desperate for someone to stay. Leaning down, he pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "Never," he promised, his voice thick with emotion but absolutely certain. A sleepy smile spread across Ella's face, her grip on his hand loosening slightly as sleep began to claim her. "You found me," she murmured, her words slightly slurred with exhaustion. Ryan smiled through the tightness in his chest, watching as her eyes fluttered closed. "No, sweetheart," he whispered, gently stroking her hair. "You found me." He sat there for a few more moments, watching her drift into peaceful sleep. The steady rise and fall of her chest reminded him of how far they'd come. On his nightstand nearby, 2 photos stood side by side. The old creased baby picture he'd carried for years, and their new family portrait, both of them beaming at the camera. The past was painful, but the future? The future was theirs to write together. If you enjoyed the story of Ryan, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.